Okay. So to start out class today, we are going to do a couple practice problems on what we were talking about at the end of whatever that last day was, Monday. We were talking about the cardiac cycle. We were talking about some heart volumes at specific times in the cardiac cycle that we may want to measure to understand what's going on in the heart. So we had some equations, but easier to understand equations if you actually do them. We're not going to try and make them too hard, but you're going to want to understand, like, if this volume goes up, if this volume goes down, what else is that going to change? So to do that, we're gonna just do some math to begin. So a reminder about what those equations were. So we're thinking about specifically stroke volume, which is how much blood is coming out of the heart during that ventricular ejection phase. And it's going to be dependent on our end diastolic volume and our end systolic volume. Because people are different from person to person in terms of how big they are, lots of other factors, what we often really care about is something called our ejection fraction, which is essentially just expressing as a percent how we compare that stroke volume, that amount of blood that came out of the heart, to the amount of blood that was left in the heart at the end of diastole, so at the end of its relaxed phase, at the end of its filling phase. So put up a little word problem on the board for us with those equations there, and then we'll take away the equations and try two more. Okay, so with this problem, what we were doing here, we're beginning with finding our end diastolic volume in this question, which is just this first number, that 150 milliliters. So at the end of the heart being at rest, its filling phase, we have 150 milliliters of blood. After we squeeze out all the blood, we have 40 milliliters left. So we just subtract that from our first number, and our stroke volume is 110. Okay, 150 minus 40. So then to find the ejection fraction, what we're comparing is these two numbers. So we're comparing how much there was to begin with how much we squeezed out rather than what's left. So we divide the two. So we took that 110, that stroke volume, and we divide it by our end diastolic volume, that amount we had in the heart at the beginning. And we got 0.73 or about 73%. So that's our ejection fraction. So we'll do 2 more real quick. Oh, sorry. Make that second one end systolic. Yeah. Okay. So let's start with this first one. Okay. So what we were doing here. Okay. So hopefully I didn't do any careless math. Let's see. Okay. So we're looking for the stroke volume in this first one. So our stroke volume, we're just looking for how much blood left the heart. So we subtract our two numbers. The end of diastole, the amount of blood that filled the heart was 90 milliliters. At the end of systole, thank you, we had 70 milliliters left. So the difference there is just 20 milliliters. We only ejected 20 milliliters of blood out of the heart. So now we have a much lower ejection fraction than we did before. So those 20 milliliters that we ejected compared to those 90 milliliters that we filled with, we have an ejection fraction of 0.22 or about 22%. Okay. So comparatively, if we then look at this other practice problem, okay, so at the end of SC, okay, so if our end diastolic volume is 100 milliliters, so at the end of our relaxed phase, we fill with 100 milliliters, we leave only 20 milliliters left at the end of systole. We've ejected a total of 80 milliliters, so that's our stroke volume. 80 divided by that original 100 at the end of our relaxed phase of the heart, about 80%, so 0.8. So as we talk about like control of the heart, changes to heart, we're going to be saying that different parts of the nervous system can like increase end diastolic volume or that they're going to increase stroke volume, things like that. So when we talk about that, this is how all those numbers are connected. And so we want to kind of cement those connections and those relationships in our mind. What we're focused on is not so much memorizing equations as like understanding these relationships to understand if this number changes, if this amount changes, these are the other things it's going to affect. Okay. So usually when I have you do math in this class, I just make you tell me like, if this number goes up, does this other number go up or down, is kind of the amount of math that we'll usually be doing. But practicing it out a couple times can help you understand that. Okay. So just a peek back at that cardiac cycle, right? We had our 4 phases. So we had, while our ventricles are filling here, we have our volumes in the heart going up. When the atria contract, we see a little blip, squeeze a little more blood. Phase 2 here was really brief. This was when our ventricles started to contract, but it was isovolumetric, so no blood was escaping. So it is this sort of plateau at the end of phase 1, and then during that isovolumetric phase, where we would record our end diastolic volume. So that's the amount of blood that makes it into the ventricle in any given heartbeat. And then our stroke volume is just the difference between that and how much blood is left in the heart after we squeeze out as much as we can squeeze out. So at the end of our ventricular ejection phase, we'll have squeezed stuff out. And then we have an isovolumetric ventricular relaxation. So the volume in the ventricle would stay the same during that phase 4. So we can start measuring at the end of phase 3, but we won't see volumetric changes in phase 4. So that's why there's this little plateau here. So those are our 2 numbers that we start with for our calculations, our end diastolic versus our end systolic. But what we're really usually interested in is how much blood left and went out to the body. That's our stroke volume, and it's just the difference between those 2 points. And another just picture of that whole cardiac cycle that we talked about last time. Okay. So we can also think about this cycle in terms of volume and in terms of pressure. So pressure is driving how our valves open. And often when we talk about volumes in the heart, they're going to be really related to pressures that we could measure. So if we draw a pressure volume curve, this is another way to express some of the properties we might measure in the heart during a cardiac cycle. So this is still showing us a cardiac cycle. It's just now we're specifically measuring the volume of our ventricles, specifically our left ventricle, because that's where we're pumping out blood to the body. So that's usually what we care about clinically if we're thinking about how much blood is getting to tissue. So how much oxygen is getting to tissue, right? Versus our pressure in that ventricle. So pressure is important because that pressure in the ventricle, in the left ventricle, is what opens our aortic semilunar valve when we have high enough pressure to overcome any pressure in the aorta. Okay? So we care about our pressures. Okay? So during this first phase of the cardiac cycle, our ventricular filling, we're going to see that we have our volume filling, right? Our phase 1 increasing. Then we are seeing a small rise in pressure, okay, but not very much. So the small rise in pressure, right, is because if you think about like, I'm going to draw you 2 little cups of water, right? So if you draw a cup of water or a cup of gas, whatever, it doesn't matter what the fluid is or what the gas is, right? If you draw something with like a little amount or something with a bigger amount and measure at a certain point, you'd have like a higher pressure if you have more stuff kind of pushing out against the walls versus if you have less stuff, right? So we're filling, so there's like a little bit of a higher pressure because there's more stuff, but that doesn't make a huge difference. So it's just a slight rise here. If you're wondering about that little blip here, think that's the atrial contraction. Okay, so we have a rise in volume, but not much rise in pressure. So then we go into our phase 2. So phase 2, that's that isovolumetric contraction. So we filled the ventricle, and now our ventricle is getting smaller because we're squeezing the heart muscle. We're contracting that heart muscle, contracting the myocardium. Okay. So we'll see here, right, if you look at the volume, this is an isovolumetric phase. So our volume did not change, iso meaning the same, right? So our volume didn't change, but our pressure really, really did, right? So we greatly increased the pressure in the ventricle during this phase 2, this isovolumetric contraction. Now, as we enter phase 3, this is when the pressure has gotten high enough that our aortic semilunar valve opened and blood starts to escape the heart. So during our ventricular ejection phase, we still see high pressures, and they actually do keep getting higher because our muscle is still contracting smaller and smaller. Okay. But what we see now is that our volume is starting to decrease. Right? So during phase 3, we have now lost blood, which is a good thing because it went into the aorta and out to the body. So we have moved this curve back to the left because that blood went out to the body. So we changed our volume here. Okay. Then during phase 4, the pressure is going to continue to fall. So phase 3 would kind of start taking us down, right, at the end. And then phase 4, that's our isovolumetric relaxation. So isovolumetric, right, same volume. So if we draw a line, right, just a straight line, you just keep that 60 milliliters of blood. But our pressure is going down, 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 down. And this is important because blood flows along pressure gradient. So we need a low pressure in the ventricle as we begin phase 1, so that blood wants to come in from the atria and fill into the ventricles. If we had high pressure in the ventricle, blood wouldn't want to move into that high pressure environment. So this is why we need this drop at the end. So this loop is really just showing us the relationship of those two things, the volume and the pressure in these chambers, specifically in the ventricles, and specifically for this picture, in the left ventricle, because that's what we care most about. A fun thing to think about when we think about the heart, fun thing, useful thing, whatever, fun and useful are somewhat similar, right? Our heart sounds. So another way that we look at the heart, another thing that we think about when we think about the heart, so we think about that sound it makes that you can hear sometimes in your ears, hopefully usually not, usually more often with like a stethoscope or something, or when you're hooked up to a machine. So those heart sounds, the lub-dub, lub-dub, lub-dub sound that you hear, this has to do with our valves. Okay, so what we're hearing, so our heart, right, our heart separating right from left, we have, and then separating our atria from our ventricles, we have our right atrioventricular valve, our tricuspid, tricuspid. Just gonna write that on there so you remember it, right? But that's our right AV valve. Okay. And then on the left side, our left AV valve is our bicuspid, so two cusps. So when you look at them in lab, you can count them. Just believe me for now. Okay, so we have our atrioventricular valves. And then we also have our semilunar valves. So when we're thinking semilunar valves, we're thinking about our pulmonary trunk going out to the lungs from the right side of the heart. I'll draw some lung. Okay. Okay. So we got our pulmonary trunk, It has valves in it. So I drew those. I drew the pulmonary trunk as blue because this is our deoxygenated blood, but it is an artery. Okay. Then our other artery, because arteries are leaving the heart, is our aorta. Okay, so our aorta also has semilunar valves in it. Okay, semilunar valve, aortic valve, right here as well. Okay, so we have AV valves, atrioventricular valves between our atria and ventricles. We have semilunar valves in our arteries. And I do draw those curves in a specific direction because it's also telling you about physically how they catch blood, right? So blood likes to flow through this way. If it tries to flow that way, they jam closed, okay? Versus blood likes to flow this way. If it tries to flow back to the heart, they pop closed the opposite way. Okay. All right, so when we're listening to our valve sounds, what we're listening to is blood kind of sloshing. So when we say we're listening to turbulent flow, you want to think about like a wave, right? So like if a wave is coming into the beach, right, makes a sound. You can hear waves crashing on the shore. But before the wave gets there, you have like a little bit of quiet kind of sound. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about turbulent flow, when we talk about heart sounds. Also, we'll think a little bit about this when we think about pressure and taking blood pressures. Okay, so what you're hearing is the turbulent flow. It is happening around the time that these valves are closing, because what you're hearing is the blood trying to backshift against those valves, okay, which is what causes their closure. So you're hearing that backshift and how it's rocking around. And this moves those cusps into their closed position as we push back. So the first one you hear is our AV valves. Okay, so the first heart sound is softer around the time of that closing of the AV valves, but it's actually coming from the blood movement itself. Okay. Our second heart sound is the louder one. Okay, so the second heart sound has to do with our semilunar valves. Okay, so our semilunar valves, right, in our pulmonary trunk and in our aorta, right, they close second. Okay. So we have the same sort of thing here happening. It's that attempt of the blood to flow back into the heart as the heart pressures are dropping that catches open these sails from the semilunar valves and causes them to close. Okay, so this is that second louder sound that we're going to hear. So we can hear part of the rhythm of the heart because we can hear first as those valves are closing. So essentially what that first sound we're hearing is as we're entering that isovolumetric ventricular contraction phase, right? So we're kind of hearing the beginning of that phase 2 of our cardiac cycle. And then our semilunar valves are closing basically at the end, right? So phase 4 is when we have our isovolumetric ventricular relaxation. So as that heart is relaxing, the pressure in the ventricles drops, which means that the blood tries to flow back because it's chasing those low pressure environments. It wants to get to somewhere it has space to, I don't know, move and be relaxed, right? So it tries to go back, gets blocked because it pulls these semilunar valves open when it does that. So that's that second heart sound. So that's what we're listening to. That's how that links up with the cardiac cycle when we hear those sounds. So we can see those mapped on here at the bottom of our big old cardiac cycle picture graph thing. So our heart sounds are showing us the times when those ventricles have their valves closed. Right. So first here we hear it during that phase 2 as those atrioventricular valves are closing and the ventricles are beginning to contract. And then we again hear a sound in phase 4 as those semilunar valves, the aortic and pulmonary valves, close so that blood doesn't flow back into the heart. So let's take a listen. I'll put this all in place. Very cool rhythm. Somebody should mix that into some kind of track. I would like that. Okay, so that's a healthy heart. So that's what it should sound like. Let's listen to it once more because it's fun. You hear how they sound a little different. The first one is a little softer. And then we can hear that pause between them, right? That pause as the heart is relaxed. So that's another sort of reminder that diastole, that relaxed phase of the heart, is a little longer than systole, that phase where we're squeezing, right? So you can hear that long, slightly longer silence has to do with that diastole, because we don't have valve movement during that relaxed phase. So next we're going to listen to an unhealthy heart. So what we're listening to here is a heart with aortic stenosis. So stenosis. So stenosis, I like to think like stone, right? So basically aortic stenosis means that that aortic valve gotten kind of hardened, right? So it's not appropriately closing and opening because it's kind of hardened. It's not nice and mobile and able to be moved by the blood. So that's what you're kind of hearing. You can hear that it's like kind of blurrier sounding. You don't have that lub dub. You have kind of a, yeah, I would describe it as blurry, kind of muffled. So you can kind of hear that a little bit. This is also faster, I believe, but that part is separate. Okay. So this is the kind of thing as you move forward and in other classes, learn how to like diagnose heart sounds or like listen to murmurs, things like that. That's what you're doing. You're listening to these sounds. You want to remember what a healthy heart sounds like. And when you hear sort of muffled sounds at different parts of this cycle, which you know what the cycle should sound like because you know you should hear those beats in phase 2 and phase 4. If you hear sloshing, you know that that blood is experiencing turbulence when it shouldn't be, and that can help you diagnose different conditions. So that's kind of what people are doing when they talk about murmurs or when they are listening to your heart, they're listening for these sounds. Cool. So now we're going to move directly into talking about cardiac output. So I'll give you a second to flip over. Okay. So we're going to do a little prediction thing. So now that we know about contractile events in the heart, right? So we know about that pathway of electricity and action potentials and our SA node and our AV node. And we know some things about our cardiac cycle too, right? So we know that the atria are contracting, filling our ventricles with blood, which are then contracting and pushing blood out to the body. And I'll link this up with some of our understanding of the nervous system at this point, because as we think about cardiac output, we're going to think about control of this system and sort of modulation of this system. And we know what parasympathetics are, what sympathetics are, and what somatic nerves are, hopefully. Okay. So this is your reminder that I like to use our heart as an example of the autonomic nervous system as something under autonomic control, something you can feel easily, right? Whether your heartbeat is slower or heartbeat is faster. We know that the autonomic nervous system, we have dual innervation of our effector organs, which is to say that if we have parasympathetics going to an organ, we also have sympathetics going to that organ because we want to be able to sort of switch between this rest and digest parasympathetic phase and the fight or flight sympathetic phase. And we have kind of like a dimmer switch between the two, have a bit more sympathetic or a bit more parasympathetic. So that is true of the heart. And as we think about cardiac output, we're going to be thinking about how the autonomic nervous system controls how fast our heart is beating and also controls how much blood it's squeezing out, right? So it's going to control that stroke volume, that ejection fraction. So this is our next equation, okay? So again, when you see equations, I am lazy and not a great memorizer. So I like to emphasize to you that what we're trying to learn here is a relationship, right? If you understand the relationship of these concepts, you don't actually really have to memorize all that much. So when we're talking about cardiac output, what we're talking about is how much blood is getting to your body in a minute, right? We're just trying to measure how much blood is getting to tissue every minute. So to do that, all you have to do is know how much blood is coming out of the heart each cycle, and then how many cycles are there in a minute, right? That's all you need to do, all you need to understand in order to figure out how much blood gets to the body in a minute. So that's what creates this equation, right? So we ask ourselves how much blood is going out to the body every minute. That is the definition of our cardiac output. Well, we know that the blood squeezes out some amount every heartbeat, or stroke volume. Right, so the stroke volume, that's what we were practicing calculating at the beginning of lecture today. That's how much blood is leaving during our ventricular ejection phase. So then we just need to know our heart rate. So, when you take your pulse, is my Fitbit working? Let's see. My pulse is currently 112 beats per minute. So you multiply by your heart rate, right? Those are the units on your heart rate, right? Is beats per minute. That's what BPM is. BPM, okay, beats per minute, right? So you multiply our volume in milliliters by our beats per minute, giving us our cardiac output. So on average, a typical cardiac output is about 5 liters per minute at rest. And the typical amount of blood volume is about 5.5 liters, right? So the difference here is we remember at the end of systole, we do have an end systolic volume. We do have some blood that kind of remains in the heart. We have some blood that may be remaining in your body. So there's a slight difference here. Okay. Let's not do this calculation right now. Let's come back to it. I can't talk and do math at the same time. I have to be quiet. So we'll come back to that one next time so that we can talk a little bit more about cardiac output. Okay, so we're going to be thinking about factors that affect this, right? That's what we really care about when we think about cardiac output. We want to think about, like, how can we have more blood go out to the tissue? We need more blood to go out to the tissue. Or what is causing not enough blood to get to the tissue if we're thinking about diagnosing some kind of pathology. Okay. So when we're thinking about cardiac output, we're going to think about the heart rate, so how fast your heartbeat is. Because if you have more heartbeats, more opportunities to get blood out of the heart. Or we can just affect how much blood we're squeezing out of the heart every heartbeat, right? If you put a whole big wave out every time you have a heartbeat, then that can also increase your cardiac output, right? So we can change how much blood gets to tissue per minute by changing how fast it's getting there with our heart rate, or by changing how much, by changing our stroke volume. So the way that we regulate how much cardiac output there is, how much blood gets to tissue, is by regulating those two things, by regulating our heart rate and by regulating the stroke volume. So we can actually change, like, how hard your heart squeezes in order to adjust that stroke volume. Okay. So we're going to have both extrinsic, so coming from elsewhere regulation, and intrinsic regulation. When we say intrinsic regulation, we're saying, like, really local stuff. So properties that have to do with the heart itself rather than with nerves coming in. So the extrinsic control is going to be coming from your nerves and also from hormones. So things like epinephrine, right? We talked about our endocrine system. So we're going to have some hormones that affect heart rate. We're going to have nerves, our autonomic nervous system affecting our heart rate, for example. And then we're also going to have properties within the heart that help us regulate the cardiac output as well. So that's the auto-regulation part. So reminder, we have our sympathetics and our parasympathetics when we're thinking about our nerves. Okay. So our parasympathetics are craniosacral in origin, so coming either from a cranial nerve or from way down at the bottom of your spinal cord, so from the sacral area. But we're almost always thinking about parasympathetics coming from our cranial nerves, actually. Specifically, the cranial nerve that sends parasympathetic innervation to the heart is our vagus nerve. So you've actually seen this or at least thought about this nerve in lab. Okay, so our vagus nerve traveling out of your skull, down through the neck, all the way down to the heart, sends innervation to both the sinoatrial node and also to our AV node, that atrioventricular node. So we're going to two parts here of the conduction pathway. So that should hopefully help you start to predict how this might affect heart rate. We have a toggle switch or a dimmer switch with our autonomic nervous system. So we have our parasympathetics going there, but our sympathetic nerves go there too. So sympathetic nerves come from the thoracolumbar region of your spinal cord, all of your thoracic spinal nerves, and the first two lumbar spinal nerves. So they're numbered just based on what vertebra we had a nerve come out below. Okay. So our sympathetic nerves come out of our spine, out of the spinal cord. They then go into our sympathetic chain. If we're talking about the ones going to the heart, this is the specific pathway for nerves to the heart. So our sympathetic chain, you'll see next semester when we get into the chest in lab. Okay. It sits there parallel to the spine. Then we have more nerves going out to the heart from there. So the places that we're going with those sympathetic nerves, just like the parasympathetics, we are going to the SA node, the sinoatrial node. Just like the parasympathetics, we are going to the AV node, the atrioventricular node. But a difference that you can notice in this picture is we actually have three little branches here. All right, so a place that our sympathetic nerves go that the parasympathetics do not is to the ventricular myocardium, so to the muscle of the ventricles. So only our sympathetic nerves are going to the ventricular muscle itself. So I'm telling you that now because this means that the sympathetics and the parasympathetics are going to have different properties that they can alter, right? Both the sympathetics and the parasympathetics are going to be able to change the heart rate, right? Because they're changing the beats by changing these nodes. But the sympathetic nervous system is also going to be able to adjust how hard the muscle squeezes. So that's why we care that the sympathetics go to the ventricular myocardium, but the parasympathetics do not. Okay. The sympathetics are going to be able to control, in part, the force that we exert with those ventricles. All right, so we're going to start with heart rate, which is what both of our sympathetics and parasympathetics can affect, but not only those two factors. Okay. So the heart rate is usually and always under normal conditions going to be determined by how frequently that sinoatrial node fires. So if an action potential happens in the sinoatrial node, it sends that impulse out to our AV node, out to the bundle of His, branching out into our right and left bundle branches, and then coming up and around from the bottom for our Purkinje fibers. The SA node fires fastest compared to our other parts of the conduction system, which is why it's the one controlling the heart rate. Okay. So its intrinsic firing rate, interestingly enough, is 100 beats per minute. So the SA node, the sinoatrial node, its autorhythmic properties, so it's automatic stuff, if you just have it there doing its thing, it's going to be at 100 beats per minute. If you've ever tracked your heart rate over like a day, or just when you're sitting down or wake up in the morning, you'll know your heartbeat is regularly, hopefully, below 100 beats per minute. Okay. So this already is a sign that most of the time you do have extrinsic control affecting your heart rate, right? So if you had no nerve going to your heart, that would cause other problems, but among them, your heart rate would be 100 beats per minute, right? Because the sinoatrial node, its intrinsic rhythm is 100 beats per minute. Okay. However, your heart rate is not at 100 beats per minute right now, or hopefully, because your parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest part of your autonomic nervous system, is usually dominant, right? So you have both those parasympathetic nerves and sympathetic nerves going to your heart. Both of them come in and touch the SA node. The parasympathetics, when you're at rest, when you have a lot of parasympathetic activity, it slows you down, okay? Slows you down, those parasympathetics slow you down. So a typical resting heart rate might be like 75-ish, right? When you're awake, okay? So if you're just sitting around, your heartbeat might be like 75, your heart rate, I should say. That is a demonstration of this extrinsic control though, because it's lower than what the SA node would set for itself. The opposite happens if you're stressed out or you're exercising, then your sympathetic nervous system takes over, right? So you get more action potentials coming down your sympathetic nerves, and they speed up your heart rate. So your heart rate can go quite a lot faster than 100 beats per minute as well. And that is largely the effect of your sympathetic nervous system. So getting into the way this works, okay? So when we look at this, we're going to be tracking right now our sympathetic activity, okay? So our sympathetic activity, our fight or flight, or also we're just going to tack on the hormone piece here because it's kind of an aside. So epinephrine, so coming from your adrenal glands, right, works pretty similarly to your sympathetic activity because that is also one of the hormones that we can ultimately kind of release and control with the sympathetic nervous system. Okay. So if we have an increase in our sympathetic activity, an increase in this sort of fight or flight response, we are going to be releasing epinephrine and norepinephrine. Okay. So these are going to affect the SA node, affect our sinoatrial node by binding to beta-1 receptors. Okay, so our beta-1 receptors, right? Beta-1 receptors are a type of adrenergic receptor, right? So we associate our adrenergic receptors with our epinephrine, norepinephrine, and therefore with the sympathetic nervous system. And so this is one of the receptor types that we see in our effector organs for the sympathetic nervous system, and we see some in the SA node. Beta receptors in specific activate that cyclic AMP second messenger inside the cell and then go on and have their effects. Okay, so we have some of that receptor in the SA node. And what it does ultimately, the effect of our sympathetic activity or the epinephrine affecting those beta-1 receptors, we're going to end up opening sodium and calcium channels. So ultimately, we have more sodium and calcium channels open. Both sodium and calcium want to come into cells in the normal conditions of your body. So they have that electrochemical driving force that drives them inward, coming into your cell. When sodium or calcium comes into a cell, they're positive ions, they're cations, okay? So this means that they depolarize the cell. So depolarization, our cells usually have a resting membrane potential that is negative. The number we like to use is like -70, right? So as we have these cations, these positive ions come in, we depolarize. So we're coming up, coming closer to zero, coming up towards, in our nerves, we were coming up to a threshold, right? That's what depolarization is. Same thing is happening here in our heart rate. So we're creating this increase in depolarization, which means we can speed up the heart rate because all the heart rate is a response to action potential, right? So as we have a more positive membrane potential, it's easier to fire off an action potential in the SA node. That's what's speeding up your heart rate. So the heart rate is reflective of that sped up rate of the action potentials. So that's kind of linking together like all the concepts, all the units that we've been through in A&P 1, right? So up until now, up until the end of class, right now we can really fully understand why all of these things are happening. And I'm pointing them all out to you because we do have a final coming up relatively soon. So we want to remember these words, even though we're doing our Unit 4 exam first. Okay, so that is how our sympathetic activity can increase the heart rate. And we'll pick up here on Friday, think more about our cardiac output. And we can do some cardiac output calculations while I have silence and a piece of paper.